The Pacific, 1942. Windswept islands, deafening surf, fire in the jungle night. Between every whisper of the sea hid death, and between every radio transmission hid risk. The United States Marine Corps had a problem that no bomb or battleship could solve: communication. In the first months of the Pacific War, orders relayed by radio often arrived too late, or worse, intercepted. The Japanese military had some of the most elite cryptanalysts in the world. They broke Allied codes faster than new ones could be written. Messages meant for commanders became maps for ambushes. By 1942, encryption was a matter of survival. Commanders needed a code impossible to break, untied to machines or mathematics, something alive. They found it in an ancient voice carried by desert wind, the Navajo language. A language the world couldn't decipher. Hundreds of Native American tribes had fought, farmed, and endured long before airplanes darkened the Pacific sky. Among them were the Diné, the Navajo people, their words flowing like river current, built on images and tones that even linguistic experts struggled to map. During World War I, Choctaw soldiers had used their tongue to confuse German interceptors. 2 decades later, history repeated itself in a more desperate war. The idea came from one unlikely source: Philip Johnston, a World War I veteran raised on a Navajo reservation. He spoke the language fluently and knew its secret. Few outsiders could even begin to pronounce it, let alone translate it. When Johnston pitched the concept of a Navajo radio code to the Marines, officers were skeptical, not for its potential, but for their ignorance of the language. He insisted a demonstration. The first test, in February 1942 at Camp Elliott, California, Johnston brought 4 Navajo volunteers before a room of uniformed doubters. The colonel produced an English message: "Reconnaissance reports enemy tanks moving south of camp. Request reinforcements." Within seconds, the Navajo men translated it into their native tongue, transmitted it over radio, and another Navajo listener at the far end decoded it flawlessly. The colonel called over his adjutant. "How long would it take you to encrypt that by machine?" "About 30 minutes, sir." The colonel turned back to Johnston. "How long did that take?" 20 seconds. The room fell silent. 20 seconds to say what machines needed 30 minutes to hide. Within weeks, the Marine Corps approved the program. 24 Navajo recruits left their homes in the desert and stepped into history. They would become known as the Code Talkers, forged in language and loyalty. Their boot camp mirrored every other Marine recruit's: mud, exhaustion, discipline. But when the yelling stopped, the real work began, inventing a code inside a language that already confounded cryptography. They used Navajo words as symbols for English letters, military terms, weapons, and tactics. Airplanes were eagle, etsa, submarines iron fish, beso lu. Battleships became whale, bombers buzzard, and tanks turtle. Every sound of nature became a line of defense. Within months, the lexicon grew, 211 words, soon expanding to over 400. Each phrase carried double meaning, literal translation worthless without the internal knowledge only Navajo minds shared. When tested under controlled conditions, no outsider, not even other native tribes, could break the code. By the summer of 1942, 29 Navajo had completed training and shipped out to the Pacific Theater. None of them yet realized they were carrying one of the most secure communication systems in military history, a language turned into legend. Baptism by fire, Guadalcanal. The Code Talkers first faced combat on the volcanic ridges of Guadalcanal, where heat and disease killed more men than bullets. Radios failed constantly, telephone lines snapped under artillery, units fought blind. Then the new code went live. When Marines needed reinforcements, Navajo operators transmitted coordinates and commands faster than anyone could copy them. Their voices poured through static, unfamiliar, rhythmic, musical. Every message was received, decoded, and acted upon flawlessly. Interceptors on Japanese ships overheard the chatter and froze. Translations produced nothing. No logic, no pattern. "It's not a cipher," one enemy analyst later admitted. "It's a madness." For the first time in the Pacific, American messages moved faster than Japanese orders. Battles no longer drowned in confusion. They became orchestras of precision. General Howard Connor, who directed communications during the brutal assault on Iwo Jima, wrote later, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken that island." By 1943, the Pacific War had shifted from defense to assault. The American military had learned to turn islands into stepping stones, each one closer to Japan: Tarawa, Saipan, Tinian, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. For every invasion, communication was the axis between survival and chaos. And in that axis, unseen yet essential, spoke the steady voices of the Navajo Code Talkers. Their code, the only unbroken code in modern history, was now the bloodstream of the Marines. The young men who carried it were a contradiction of worlds, warriors from deep within the American Southwest guiding fleets through oceans they had never seen. The language that saved a fleet. The system worked through memory alone. Nothing was written. Every operator memorized hundreds of terms, linking military hardware, tactics, and even entire phrases to Navajo metaphors. A battleship was a lotso, a whale; a fighter plane, dati, hummingbird; code for incoming shellfire, dine bizad, talking god. This poetic arsenal became combat shorthand faster than any cipher machine ever produced. During the invasion of Tarawa Atoll in 1943, the system met its first true trial by fire. Amid 17,000 U.S. Marines and Japanese defenders dug into coral tunnels, conventional communication failed. Wires were cut, runners killed, radios jammed by gunfire. The code talkers' voices stayed calm through hiss and static. Within 2 days, they transmitted more than 800 critical messages, every one delivered without error. Commanders couldn't believe it. Orders that previously took hours to encrypt now took under a minute. One Marine major said, "It was as if the island itself spoke English to us again." The Japanese heard the same syllables and called them ghost voices. Their cryptographers dubbed it the Code of Wind, believing Americans had invented a new mechanical signal generator. They searched captured radios for non-existent machines. They found nothing because the machine was human. A secret within a secret. The success of the program turned the Navajos into living secrets. Their identities, missions, and even existence vanished from the public eye. In reports, they were listed as radio specialists. Photographers could snap pictures, but captions named them only as Marines. They couldn't write home about what they did. Even their families didn't know the full truth, that their son's ancestral tongue had become a national weapon. When nights fell on the Pacific, code talkers gathered quietly by their transmitters, their words flowing like hymns through static. Between bombardments, they sang softly to calm nerves, ancient songs from their homeland. Some traced small sand circles beside the radios, invoking harmony between sky and earth. One later wrote, "I spoke to the sea in Navajo, and it did not devour me." Yet prejudice lingered. Even serving side by side, some Marines didn't grasp who these men were. A few mistook them for Japanese spies until officers intervened. So code talkers carried handmade ID cards reading, "I am an American Navajo, do not shoot." They belonged to a country that had once suppressed their language, and now couldn't win without it. Cracking the uncrackable Japanese intelligence threw every resource at deciphering the mysterious transmissions. Linguists recorded fragments, trying to match them to Native American words cataloged from old U.S. military archives. But Navajo was far more complex than dictionaries. The language had no written alphabet back then, no direct equivalents for English grammar, and regional tonal nuances that confused even computers decades later. To compound their frustration, individual code talkers used alternate synonyms or switched word order for security. The Japanese called it linguistic smoke. By the end of the war, their cryptanalysts credited it as the only Allied code immune to penetration. Tinian, Saipan, Guam, the voices of victory. As the Marines swept across the Central Pacific, the Navajo network expanded. Dozens turned to hundreds. Every major amphibious landing included teams of trained code talkers dispersed in pairs. One to send, one to receive. At Saipan in 1944, 82 teams coordinated ground forces and naval gunfire under non-stop Japanese artillery. The entire invasion force depended on their timing. Lieutenant William Hall recalled, "When your radio was hit, you didn't worry. You prayed your Navajo was still breathing." At Tinian, where the runways for the Enola Gay would later be built, code talkers helped relay positional coordinates between ships and beachheads so seamlessly that the battle lasted just 8 days. Commanders measured efficiency in minutes saved and lives spared. The horrors of Iwo Jima. Then came the crucible. Iwo Jima, February 1945. The island was only 8 square miles of volcanic ash, but Japan had transformed it into a fortress with miles of tunnels and bunkers. Communication cables burned every hour. Runners couldn't move 10 yards without dying. Precision was everything. Throughout that inferno, 23 Navajo Code Talkers operated in shifts around the clock. From command ships to beach radios, they transmitted more than 800 messages on the first day alone. Major Howard Connor of the 5th Marine Division later said, "During the 2 days Iwo fell, I had 6 Navajo radiomen. Working without rest or error, they handled over 800 vital messages. The entire operation depended on them. If it weren't for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." Their Coral Island whisper carried artillery adjustments, coordinates for advancing tanks, requests for medics in killing fields. No message ever went astray. And never, not once, did the Japanese crack a single line. Inside their foxholes, Code Talkers operated soaked in sweat and sulfuric dust. When grenades rocked the ground, they shielded their radios first. They joked grimly that the antennas were their new totems. Each night, their words traveled from palm-sized microphones to the horizon, from the ancient mesa of their heritage straight into modern history. The war ends in silence. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, none of the Navajos could speak of their role. Secrecy orders bound them tighter than their dog tags. They returned quietly to reservations, working farms, schools, and shops. Many faced again the irony they had left behind. Outside the Corps, their traditional language was still discouraged, sometimes mocked. For 2 decades, their bravery lived only in internal reports sealed under top secret. One Code Talker later said, "We went home proud, but couldn't tell our own families what pride meant." Only in 1968, more than 20 years later, did the U.S. government declassify the Navajo Code. The revelation astonished the world. A language once punished in boarding schools had saved thousands of American lives. Recognition long overdue. When the story broke, aging veterans of Tarawa and Iwo Jima wrote letters demanding the Code Talkers receive medals. Congress agreed. Slowly, honors trickled in: silver stars, bronze stars. Finally, in 2001, the Congressional Gold Medal to the original 29 authors of the code, with replicas for later generations. At the ceremony, the last living code creators stood before the president in traditional jewelry and wrinkled uniforms. Cameras flashed as the man at the podium addressed them in Navajo. "Thank you. You gave us victory with your words." They replied with a salute and a single phrase: "Ahe-he," gratitude. Behind them stood Marines of every color, every creed, united by the sound that had once come through radio static in the darkest days of war. The legacy of words as weapons. The Navajo Code Talkers taught the modern world an enduring paradox, that language born for harmony can also defend life. Their dialect was never meant for violence. It carried stories of origin, of mountains and wind. But when fascism threatened to silence freedom, the Diné turned that language into armor. More than 400 men served as Code Talkers before war's end. 13 gave their lives, none lost a message. Their contribution reshaped cryptography. Modern digital encryption still borrows from their principle: security through diversity, through structure outsiders cannot imitate. And perhaps something deeper. They proved that the most unassuming voices can steer the direction of world history. When the Pacific finally went silent, the Code Talkers packed away their radios and vocabulary lists. They stepped off troop ships not as heroes, but as ghosts, men whose stories couldn't be told. For 23 years, the world celebrated the end of World War II without knowing the warriors whose voices had threaded through every victory order in the Pacific. To most Americans, the Navajo were still a people of reservations and hardship, not the reason thousands of soldiers had made it home alive. And yet every word that had echoed between islands still hummed quietly beneath telephone wires, beneath radar waves, beneath the very concept of encoded communication. Back to the desert. The war ended with parades in Times Square, fireworks over battleships, but in Arizona and New Mexico, there were no brass bands. A few Marines rode dusty buses home to red mesas and canyons where families waited with tears and questions. They hugged, smiled, and held back every story they weren't allowed to tell. Government secrecy orders reminded them, the code remains classified. Letters describing battles, transmissions, even the names of their fallen brothers were censored. They became civilians again, carrying invisible history. For some, adaptation was impossible. PTSD went unrecognized, employment scarce. Others turned their discipline into leadership, teaching, ranching, building roads on lands where electricity had yet to reach. But a shadow lingered. One veteran recalled people asking him, "Did our language really help?" He could only smile. "You'll know someday," he said. A country that forgot. During the 1950s, America raced into a new age of atomic science and Cold War paranoia. The Navajo story disappeared again, buried under both government silence and cultural prejudice. The same institutions that had celebrated scientific innovation still forced Native children into schools that forbade their mother tongues. Ironically, while Navajo words had saved lives overseas, they were now erased at home, punished as outdated relics. Elders wept watching grandchildren forbidden to speak what had defended freedom. Few outside tribal lands knew that, within those syllables, lay one of the greatest unbroken codes the world had ever seen. The veterans carried the burden in private. They met occasionally on reservations, sharing memories only among themselves. Around campfires, they retold missions using English stand-ins. When we called the turtles to the whales, cryptic phrases only they understood. It was safer that way. Rediscovery. The turning point came in 1968, when military secrecy finally lifted. The United States announced that the Navajo Code had remained unbroken throughout the entire war. Newspapers seized on the revelation, astonished headlines shouting what had been buried for a generation. Suddenly, men who'd worked in silence became national celebrities. Journalists visited reservations, hunting interviews. Classrooms invited veterans to speak. The world learned names it should have honored decades earlier. Chester Nez, one of the original 29, Samuel Tissot, John Brown Jr. Each had stories that sounded mythic but were entirely real. Chester Nez described carrying the first prototype radios through Saipan under sniper fire. "The enemy couldn't hear what we said, but our men did, and they lived because of that." The revelation astonished cryptographers. Mathematicians compared the structure of Navajo syntax to complex substitution ciphers. One wrote in admiration, "It was the only code built by nature itself." Recognition, at last. By the 1980s, the surviving code talkers finally walked halls of honor rather than interrogation rooms. The Marine Corps invited them to ceremonies, historians filmed documentaries. Veterans groups raised funds for memorial statues, bronze figures holding microphones instead of rifles. Then, in 2001, almost 60 years after Guadalcanal, the nation corrected its silence. The U.S. Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the original 29 code talkers and silver medals to those who followed. During the ceremony, a Navajo choir sang both in English and Diné Bizaad, the very language once banned in public schools now echoing inside the Capitol Rotunda. Chester Nez rose from his chair, voice shaking. "They told us to forget this language. Then they told us to save the world with it. Today we forgive and we thank you." President Bush simply replied, "You carried our words through fire and gave them back unburned." Beyond honor, the legacy of the code, the recognition was more than overdue medals. It redefined how America viewed native languages. Linguists began documenting Navajo grammars not as folklore but as structures of high mathematical order. Secret Service officials studied the code anew, astonished that complexity so pure had existed outside machines. Academics later coined a term, organic encryption. It meant a communication system built not from ciphers but from human culture itself. Computers could imitate it but never invent it. Meanwhile, young Navajo students rediscovered pride through heritage classes, learning the same words their grandfathers spoke through static at Iwo Jima. In coding boot camps and cybersecurity seminars, trainers compared digital encryption keys to the voices of the first code talkers. Every algorithm protecting the modern internet owes spiritual debt to the concept those Marines carried across the Pacific, the burden of memory. Yet even late recognition carried sorrow. Many of the original 29 had died before the medals, their stories confined to aging family notebooks. Survivors felt joy tempered by ghosts. "Sometimes," one confessed in his 80s, "I still hear the radios buzzing at night. Maybe it's just memory, or maybe ancestors checking that we remembered." His words capture why their story outlives statistics. The Code Talkers didn't just save lives, they bridged two civilizations, one drowning in war, one surviving centuries of erasure, and proved them inseparable. A biographer writing in the 1990s phrased it perfectly. The men who spoke to the Marines in a dying tongue gave birth to the language of tomorrow. Modern comparisons. Today, cybersecurity experts describe their fields in metaphors drawn directly from that history. Layers of encoding, shared secrets, distributed trust, all echoes of 1942 radios humming under rain. Military academies cite the Navajo Project as the only encryption system achieved without technology, yet rivaling quantum security. Even Hollywood, with its dramatizations and myths, cannot exaggerate the reality. There truly was a time when a few dozen young men made the difference between lost islands and liberation. Personal echoes. Before his death in 2014, Chester Nez, the last of the original 29, gave an interview that summarized everything the medals and speeches never could. Sitting in his yard near Gallup, New Mexico, wrapped in a blanket patterned with eagles, he smiled and said, "We never thought of ourselves as heroes. We simply talked and our friends heard us. That was enough." He paused, then added in Navajo, "The language is still listening." To this day, children at Dene schools recite those words during morning assemblies. They translate them twice, once into English, once back, a ritual proving that old voices still shape new tongues. What the Navajo taught the world, their story endures because it reaches beyond nationality. It reminds us that ingenuity doesn't always come from laboratories or generals, but from necessity joined with culture. When technology failed, humanity succeeded. In the chaos of World War II, victory often depended on destruction. The Code Talkers inverted that logic. They won through preservation, protecting words instead of erasing them. The modern world now fights to save endangered languages because of them. UNESCO cites the Navajo example in nearly every program for linguistic diversity. Technologists train AI systems on Hopi, Cherokee, Inuktitut, Maori, and hundreds more. Each new database whispers the same truth. Every language is a potential code for peace. The universal cipher. Ask cryptographers today what makes a perfect code, and some will still answer softly, one that lives. That is what the Navajo gave the 20th century, a living code, unbreakable because it beat in human rhythm. Others followed, wind talkers among Comanche, Cree, Basque, but none matched the scale or success of the DNA network. Their achievement closes a circle thousands of years long, from sacred chants around desert fires to encrypted messages guiding fleets through Pacific storms. Language had journeyed from myth to modem, and through it all, the Navajo reminded us that the most advanced technology on Earth is still the human voice. A quiet ending. Visit the high desert at dusk. The wind whistles across the mesas, the same sound heard by the first recruits leaving for war in 1942. If you listen closely, it still resembles radio static, rough, rhythmic, endless. To some, it's just weather. To others, it's history. Whispering in code. Words matter. Voices save. Never let silence win again.